Thank you very much indeed for that, Brendan, and the cheque is in the post in respect of the review anyway. It was congratulations as well on the book, Dahi and Brendan. It's a really fine piece of work, and I'd encourage people to read it. Brendan said to me earlier that I was supposed to be speaking on this part of the session on behalf of Charlie Flanagan, and the thought that I would speak on behalf of the Irish government now at this stage would mean that Enda Kenny and all his cabinet ministers would leave Lissadell, come up here in Glenties to prevent me from speaking. So I'm not speaking on their behalf this morning. I'm speaking entirely on my own. The last time I spoke at the McGill Summer School, I was Minister of State in the Department of Finance and Public Expenditure and Reform. And it just shows you I was elected to the European Parliament, even though people thought, how could it be possible that someone who worked in the Department of Finance for 3.5 grave years, cutting expenditure and raising tax, could ever be elected to anything, but I managed to get there nonetheless. I'd like to speak this morning, if I can, on this whole question of Brexit, and then later on we will look at some of the questions of reform that needs to be inculcated within the European Union. But in the 15 minutes or so right now, I'd like to just deal with the whole question of the upcoming referendum in Britain. I also want to welcome especially our visitors from Scotland and from England here today, and thank them indeed for their contribution. I was always struck when Douglas Carswell left his party to join UKIP. He caused for a by-election to be held, and he faced the public, and the public gave him a mandate again. And I think there's something particularly honourable in that. If you are elected for one political party and then choose to leave for another political party, or even set up your own political party, I think there is a certain responsibility on you to have a by-election. And I wish some of our own students of that would do the same, actually. Because this isn't about you, Douglas, it's about some of my colleagues here, actually. You're leading by example on this. So all of these pop-up parties, if they choose to leave us, they should really ask the public what they think about it. And I suspect they might get their answer. It was Bernard Ingham, that great Margaret Thatcher pressman for 30 years, a loyal press secretary to Thatcher, was asked when he retired what were the headlines that Margaret Thatcher most wanted to see at the end of a European summit. And he thought about it for a while, and he said, yeah, there were two particular headlines that she loved in the British press the next day after a European summit. The first was, Thatcher defies Europe. She liked that. And the other one was, Thatcher thrashes Europe. And he said both of them were interchangeable, and if you could have both headlines, that's all the better for it. And it goes to the heart, really, in some way, of the British relationship, or even the English relationship, as Dahi said, with Europe. It was Churchill, in that famous Zurich speech that he gave in 1946, who did speak about the emergence of a United States of Europe, quite similar to a United States of America. And the United States of Europe, in Churchill's view, was a means through which Europe could come together after the divisions of the two world wars. But Churchill's view, and I suspect the view of most post-war British leaders on both sides of the divide in the House of Commons, was that Britain would be bystanders. Britain were very much in favour of what was going on, encouraged the Europeans to sort out their problems, but ultimately Britain would be bystanders in this entire endeavour. And there is an inherent contradiction in that, and Douglas and others have spoken about the Eurozone, and we'll speak about that later. But at one level, if you're constantly bystanders, encouraging people to do what's in the interest of, as you perceive it, and then you want to have special deals, in amongst all of that negotiation, there is an inherent contradiction in that, in my view. And I think essentially Britain has never fully understood why Europe has needed the EEC, the EU, call it what you will. I don't think at its heart the British fully understand why Europe is so important to the countries of Europe. Douglas spoke about the lowering share of GDP across Europe. The fact of the matter is this: when our country joined the EEC in 1973-74, in terms of average, the old-fashioned way we say in economics, average industrial pay, we represented in per capita terms about 60% of the then average across the then EEC member states, 60% of the average. Today, even after our financial crisis, 40-odd years of membership, we are still 25% more than the average across the other member states of the European Union. And the experience for Ireland in joining the EC, instead of having our interest rate set by the Bank of England, instead of having our relationship in trade terms determined by the British, we now had to determine on a much wider audience. And in pure per capita terms, in pure GDP terms, in pure size of economy terms, in pure employment, we were a country of 1 million people 20 years ago in terms of workers. We had 1 million people in our labour force. We now have just 1.9, soon to be hopefully 2 million again. We had 2 million in the midst of the madness years. So, on any objective sense, the British, I think, failure to understand where other countries are coming from is as important as for us to understand where they're coming from. And I think, equally, there's a failure to understand why the EU is so important to Germany. The Germans needed the EU after the war as a means of showing to Europe, especially, their commitment to democracy after Nazism. The same is true in the French-German relationship that was built after the Second World War. There was a kind of an agreement that France and Germany would never ever go to war again because it was economic madness and economic suicide to do that. There's a need to understand that. For countries like Spain, Italy and Greece, joining the EEC at the time was a means of bookending that dreadful period of dictatorship and military control, and a means of proving to Europe that Spain, that Italy, Portugal even, were now fully fledged democracies, are becoming fully fledged democracies. For our reasons, it was somewhat different. As I said, we were entirely dependent on the British up until the 1970s. That was brilliantly shown by De Valera in the I'm a great fan of De Valera. As a Fine Gael politician, I have a huge respect for De Valera. But the most madness policy was the economic war with Britain. If ever there was an example of default, when we managed to endeavour that, we lost out hugely. And it highlighted our dependence on the British in terms of setting the rules of the game. Now we set the rules of the game on a much bigger level, of course, where we're participants in that. But Ireland's membership of the European Union was really about Ireland coming out into the world, making sure that we could trade differently, making sure that we had opportunities of winning more trade, making sure that also we could change our relationship with Britain. Our economies today are totally interconnected, not just in trade terms. If you look at the British economy today and the Irish economy, we're quite similar. We are both Northern European, high levels of privatisation, high levels of liberalisation in terms of our economies, not huge numbers of public sector employees vis-à-vis Mediterranean economies. British and Irish economies are quite similar in terms of export. Both are booming export countries. Mediterranean economies are much more focused on domestic economies. We are very similar in that respect. We have a high level of IT, financial services, as indeed the British have as well. So for us, our economic model actually is quite similar to the British economic model in terms of its low corporate tax and also in terms as well of encouraging R&D. Free trade, free trade, which is really at the heart of the European Union experience, is really at the epicentre of British experience, of British business culture as well. If ever there was a country that showed to the world the importance of free trade, it was the British. So it's important, crucially important for us, I would have thought, that Britain remains within the European Union because of what it brings to the European Union. Not only is it a creditor country, in that it pays more in than it takes out of the EU budget. I regularly hear this issue raised in UK debates. It is a AAA country, although it's lost it recently, but we'll get it back soon enough. But it's one of only 4 AAA countries actually within the European Union currently, crucially important for future investment in Europe. But it brings with it a wealth of business experience, business acumen, and exporting prowess that it really are the things that Europe needs to inculcate right the way across the European-wide economy. So those British values are really important, not just to us, but also in terms of the European Union. And the truth of the matter is this. When it came to our negotiations at Council across a whole range of areas, we have a very similar view about matters when it comes to the economy. Frequently, we quite encourage the British to go forward as a big country to make the arguments that we'd like to make and that we hide under their skirts at times at Council negotiations. That always happens. But without them there, that would be a difficulty for us. I think the big difference, however, in Britain and Ireland joining at the same time, the big difference in terms of the European Union, has been the attitude to Northern Ireland. When Ireland joined the EC as it was, we were member states becoming a member of a larger club. We took our seat around the table. And I think that has greatly helped us in trying to overcome the difficulty of Northern Ireland over the course of the last 3 decades or so. No longer was it an issue of Britain and Ireland fighting each other on this question, but it became, as Dahi said, a joint project in trying to resolve the outstanding issues in Northern Ireland. And it was our membership of the European Union which helped us make sure that that deal could be obtained. I've also a view that Britain has never really understood why Europe needed this European Union in the first place. Now, when you look at this question, I mean, Britain had won the war. Their institutions were not disgraced in the same way that the political and judicial institutions of continental fascist Europe were. Britain had seen off the threat of tyranny, if you like. The British institutions remained totally intact in post-World War II Europe. But I think we've got to understand the historic reasons and the difficulties that they had in joining the European Union. One, they had won the war, as I said. Two, they were prevented in joining the EEC because of French interests and de Gaulle for about 15 years, and we had to wait in line with them. So I do think that this referendum opportunity that's coming down the tracks, as it were, is a crucially important issue. I have a friend of mine in London, and I speak to him regularly, and he makes the point, I'm 45, he's 45, he makes the point that he has never voted for this thing. He's not saying he won't vote for it, but he really thinks that the opportunity of having a referendum now is the right decision for Britain, for resolving this question once and for all, or at least for the next generation. Now, we have a history in this country of having constant referendums on the European Union. Even when we get the result wrong, we have another referendum. But at least it forces the political parties here in the Republic to campaign, to have public meetings, to leaflet drop, to try to explain why this treaty change is important in one way or the other. So I think it is hugely significant that a referendum will now take place, and I think it's also significant that this lead-up period will have to be filled now by the question of what will come from that in terms of the negotiation. Douglas spoke about his decision, the Conservative decision, to leave the European People's Party, which is our own political family, which Fine Gael is a member of in the European People's Party. The one advantage of the Conservatives leaving was, when it comes to Britain now, German colleagues come to the four Fine Gael members and try to find out what's going on in Britain as a means of interpreting what's happening. But I think once you move away from the large political groupings in the European Parliament, you really do not have the influence that you need to have to change the regulations that others have spoken about ultimately, notwithstanding the fact that 70% of all financial law across the 28 member states is now determined in co-decision making between our committee, our Econ committee in Parliament, and the Council. 70% of all financial law is determined in Brussels. There's a reason for that, of course. The reason is to do with the stability of the financial system and trying to resolve the issues surrounding further growth and prosperity within the European Union. So it is the case that I think the referendum in itself will have the effect of resolving this question once and for all. So what can Prime Minister Cameron hope to obtain from these talks? What's the likely outcome of the negotiation? Firstly, there's nothing that David Cameron has said thus far which will not allow him to do a deal. If you look at his Bloomberg speech, if you see his remarks in the recent British election, he has not boxed himself into any particular corner. He is looking for a deal. He has set out the means through which that deal can be obtained. And there is a very strong support within Germany especially and elsewhere to make sure that he can obtain a deal. However, I think the British make this significant mistake in consistently arguing for reform for the European Union on their terms. There is a wider issue of European reform that some of us will talk about later. But I think Tony Blair was right to say in a speech recently that too often that reform agenda is a means of addressing British concerns, when actually there is a very substantial number of countries who want the same kind of reform that Prime Minister Cameron and others are looking for. The big concern that exists in the European Union is, were Britain to leave, who would go next? Would it be the Finns? Would it be the Dutch? Would it be other creditor countries? And I think we've got to recognise that there could be a domino effect were Britain to leave the European Union, which I think is a bigger issue, quite frankly, than obsessing about Britain and Ireland. Whatever happens one way or the other, we will resolve it. We will have to resolve it. There will have to be a special deal for Ireland were the British to leave. We saw that recently in the financial transaction tax. In many respects, it suits Ireland. I mean, this is something completely left field. It suits Ireland in many respects to have the British outside of the euro, and we're in the euro, because we can pick and choose the things that we want to do best of all. And I remember that debate at the Council chamber myself on the whole question of financial transaction tax. It didn't suit us, for financial services in Dublin, to have a new financial transaction tax. The British said they're not going there, and we were able to say to the others, we're not going there because that would give a competitive advantage to the City of London over Dublin. So there are complicated layers of advantage from a diplomatic level in trying to negotiate our position on these issues. But I think Blair's comments are interesting. His point is that too often the debate is centred on what British concerns are, rather than on EU-wide concerns. So what are the things that we can do for David Cameron, which can allow him to put an agreement to the British people? Firstly, I think there needs to be an honest, stock-taking exercise of the internal market. The internal market, when it's functioning properly, helps everyone within the European Union. Secondly, I think we do have to appreciate British sensitivities around the Eurozone. Now, Dahi has said we need to recognise that they will never join. I'd never say never, because it's always a dangerous thing in politics to say that. But we do need to have some system which will allow their concerns to be reflected in Eurozone decision making. And later on this morning I'll talk about what we need to do in terms of getting the euro right. There also needs to be a final acceptance that I suppose the EU is permanently two-speed, but never say never in my view. I mean, at the moment we have just 19 member states of the Eurozone. I thought it was going to be 18 last week, but it's actually 19. And I would make the point that by Lithuania joining, we've gone from 18 to 19. That means there are 9 countries outside of the Eurozone. Are we saying perpetually, forever, that those 9 countries will never join the Eurozone? It seems to be a rather dangerous thing to say. 7 of those 9 countries have actually said they want to join at some point, but not now. So presuming forever, 15 years, 20 years into the future, that the Eurozone will remain as it is, and there will be no further members to join, I think is a dangerous thing. But we do need to find a means of understanding British concerns as non-Eurozone members. We need better decision-making, less interinstitutional gridlock. We also need to use the EU budget better to stimulate jobs and growth and SME development. We need to have greater involvement of national parliaments in EU legislation and how that legislation can be shaped. But there is one issue that there will not be a deal on. There is one issue that is a no-go area when it comes to treaty change, and it's on the question of the freedom of movement of people, goods, capital and services, especially when it comes to people. I was in Poland recently, speaking to colleagues there, and the Polish are very upset with the British right now because of the tabloid headlines about Polish workers and all the rest of it. But the truth of the matter is this: the British, as much as the Irish, were happy to see the Poles come and take up jobs that no one else would do, and then to find that they've been blamed for taking up those jobs. We either have the freedom of movement of people across the 28 or we don't. And I think there is a strong resolve, a strong determination within the Member States that we cannot change on that issue, and we will not change on that issue. Now, if that issue is off the table, can a deal be done on the basis of the issues that I have mentioned just above? Yes, I think we can do a deal. It's then a matter for Prime Minister Cameron and other parties and how they actually articulate that to the British people by way of a referendum next year to make sure that a deal goes over the line. Douglas spoke about crossroads being very interesting places, which they are. They're also very confusing places. And sometimes you need to take a long time to go through a crossroads to find your way there. And I think being part of something that is much larger, as the European Union is, gives people the certainty and the stability that people need in terms of navigating their way around what is a very complicated, globalised world. My last remark this morning, ladies and gentlemen, really is kind of a tug of the heart. When I was elected to the European Parliament, our family moved to Brussels, and myself and my 12-year-old son, we went from Rosslare to Cherbourg with a big car with loads of stuff, as you can imagine, and then we drove from Cherbourg to Brussels, which is about an 8-hour journey. And I was doing my best to explain to my 12-year-old potted European history, from a biased Irish perspective, I suspect. But you are struck along that French-Belgium coastline, that parallel road that goes to Brussels. You are struck by history everywhere you go. And the names just cry out: Omaha, Bayeux, Lisieux, Dunkirk, Calais, Waterloo, Mons, where my own great-grandfather actually was taken as a prisoner of war in the First World War, the first major engagement by the Irish troops in the First World War. All of those place names, those maps, those areas, cry out as to the connection of British history to European history. It is something real. A whole generation of people of English, Scottish, Irish, Welsh people, part of whatever entity it was at the time, gave their lives. 40 million people in the first half of the last century gave their lives. And the idea that Britain would disconnect itself from that history by a go-it-alone approach is, for me, and I think for a lot of people in Britain, really difficult to get one's head around, because of the fact that such a sacrifice was made by that fallen generation for peace and for security and for democracy and freedom in Europe. The idea that Britain would extricate itself from that right now and not be part of the future history of the European Union is something that I think a lot of people in this country and in the UK find hard to believe. We have to get a deal that is sensible, a deal that's good for Britain, a deal that's good for Europe, but ultimately a deal which will allow the British to resolve this question, and in doing so, bring some certainty in our relationship with them as well. Thank you very much.